Buongiorno.
Good evening and welcome to this second event of this cycle focusing on the momentous change. This cycle was officially opened by President Violante, who conceived it, and will continue on Thursday with the third meeting with the governor of the Bank of Italy, Mr. Visco. Violante first provided the human and institutional scenario of this momentous change, of this era of change, and today we're going to focus on a very important topic, a crucial one, which is demographics. We receive many different questions concerning immigration law. There is a wonderful exhibition on the new migrants, but the first task incumbent on us is to realize what's happening. In yesterday's meeting with Enrico Letta, he said, when I was born, there were 3 billion people. In a short while, when I'm going to die, there's going to be 10 billion people in the world. So everything is changing. People's ratio is now changing. Europe will be less important in the future. So today we're here to understand this topic. Everybody's wondering what's happening, but probably we don't fully know the scenario. In order to understand that, we have with us Professor Massimo Livi Bacci. He's one of the major Italian demographers. He's famous worldwide at an international level. He writes in many important newspapers. And so, just like we used to do, we can make an in-depth analysis of this topic, trying to understand the underlying reasons and the most important aspects, so as to provide a more reasonable assessment. So the professor will give first a sort of keynote speech, and then there's going to be a couple of questions. The first one by Margarita Edna, who's been involved in the organization of the exhibition, so that we can have a comprehensive overview of the topic. So thank you very much to Massimo Livi Bacci for joining us here, and I'm going to give him the floor. So I'm going to stand up to speak, if you allow me to do so. So good evening to all of you. Thank you to the meeting for inviting me here. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you very much to Luciano Violante, who's been organizing the 3 meetings, and to Professor Vittadini, who's the real soul, let's say, of this meeting. I was asked to focus on migration. Clearly, as you all know, this topic is so varied and so complex. It has many different aspects changing over the time, and I think it would be impossible to talk about it in a comprehensive way. In any case, first of all, mobility, the ability to change the context where we live, is a human requirement, is a human necessity. Men and women do move. This has always been the case in the history of mankind. We wouldn't be here had there been no great migration from Africa, or if mankind did not live in the world. However, over the times, migrations have been different. So over the time, migrations have changed, and even the underlying causes of migration have changed. Who were migrants over the time? Migration is both a choice and a selection. Not everyone migrates. Not everybody moves. And the push towards migration has been changing over the time. Here you can see a chart. You can't see it very well probably, but that is what was called by a great Italian genetist, Luca Cavalli Forza, the wave of progress of agriculture. So this is when agriculture was invented. When agriculture was invented, people started to move throughout continents. And agriculture moved throughout continents. It scattered around. How did it do so? So there's basically two theories. One theory concerns imitation. So agriculture spread out because agricultural techniques were learned by somebody else through communication among different social groups. And Cavalli Sforza talked about a different theory. Farmers migrated together with their agricultural techniques. Farmers had the necessary skills and knowledge, and they took them away with them, migrating throughout different countries. So you can see a map here. So 10,000 years ago, up to 4,000 years ago, agriculture moved in Europe, starting from the south East Europe, from the Middle East, the Eastern Mediterranean, and the fertile ground of Euphrates and Tigris, up to the northwest of the European continent. It moved very slowly, on average 1 kilometer every year, so over 4,000 or 5,000 years is scattered around Europe. Hence there was a great migration, but a slow one. There was a similar migration known as Drang nach Osten, so the migration towards the east of German colonists from the year 1000 to the year 1300. So migrants went over the Rhine and went towards the east, occupying Central European territories. That was an agricultural migration. Farmers used to settle in desert areas or very little populated areas, mainly occupied by Slavs who were semi-nomadic. So they didn't settle in a territory, they used to move. These farmers were organized by the big chevalier orders or by the big monk orders having a lot of money, and they were provided with tools, as in carts, animals, seeds, and all the agricultural tools. So they did have their own equipment materials. So it was a planned migration, an agricultural migration that took place very slowly by conquering new territories. Cities were founded as well as villages. Villages grew up in terms of population because migrants usually had big families, and therefore new generations went scattered over and over again throughout the territory. And that was a slow migration. This is the run towards the west. As we say, go west, young man. So there were colonies too, the colonists too, with big families. In order to cultivate land successfully, they needed to have big families who would generate new generations and that were going to the west. These were traditional migrations, whereas this is slave ships. 10 million Africans, 10 million blacks were transported from Africa to the Americas between 1550, especially 600s, 1600s, and the abolition of slavery in the 18th century. That was the slave ship. This is what you can see here in the slide. This is an organized migration where migrants are just goods. So African populations were transplanted into the American continent. That was a forced migration, and we have many different examples of forced migration in history. Here we're not talking about German migrants in the Middle Ages provided with their own agricultural tools and going elsewhere. This is human meat that was transported. So a different type of migration. That was the end of the 19th century. That was a modern slave ship after the abolishment of slavery. Sorry, I'm also mobile and I tended not to speak in the microphone. I do apologize for that. So these were workers working for collecting caoutchouc in the Amazon forest. They were not legally slaves, but they were going there to work. So these were different forms of forced migration. However, there were also different types of migration. That was the Mayflower, the ship. This is symbolic. They were the pilgrims of Mayflower, which in 1620 arrived in Cape Cod. And they launched the migration and the rural settlement in America. That was a free migration. There were religious conflicts at the time, but nobody wanted to kill the pilgrims. They just went away out of their choice. And this is yet again another type of migration. Just like there were migrations in the Mediterranean during classical Greece when cities organized migration for part of the population, and the population just left and went to settle in different countries of the Mediterranean. So the population was expanding, the Greek civilization was expanding through migration. I'm showing you these images because they represent different types of migration. This is the 19th century migration connected to the great globalization. This is Little Italy, Mulberry Street in New York in the 1900s. These were the Italians migrating, and this is yet again another type of migration. Big families at that time were no longer an advantage because the migration to big cities was mostly made by lonely men or women who then got married at a later stage with some friends of the family, or so they got married, they created a family of their own, but At the end of the 19th century, Italian migrants or Greek migrants or migrants coming from Eastern Europe did not have big families. It was not an advantage for them because they had to work in big cities, and being alone for them was an advantage. Yet again, another form of different migration. This is the Italian migration to Europe in the 1950s. We've been watching this in the films. That was very similar to the big migration wave to Americas in the 1900s. But there was another type of migration. I'm not showing you now modern images, which unfortunately we see every day in our television, iPads, or mobile phones. That's the type of migration. We forgot that in the post-World War period, some 16 million European refugees migrated to Northern Europe, coming from East, West, um, generating a lot of exchanges between population. This is a train full of refugees in Berlin Station in 1945. And we forgot these episodes of this post-World War period, just like we forgot the migration of refugees after the Yugoslav war in the 1990s, or from Albania after the failure of the state. And we're just now concentrating on modern conflicts, but unfortunately, these forms of migration were very common. So this is just the first part of my speech. And this is interesting because it explains that we use the word migration as if it was just one type of migration. We put everything together. When we talk about migration, we talk about refugees escaping from bombs in Syria, as well as economic refugees looking for a better life. But the causes, the underlying causes, are extremely different. So when we talk about migration, we always talk about the same thing. We think that everything is the same, but there are different times and different ways of migrating, which today still apply. So there are people escaping from death, and there are people escaping from poverty. Both things are humane, but there's a different scale of priority, if you can understand, because one thing is to risk dying, one thing is to risk being poor. It's two different scales united by the same aim, as in to live better and not to die. Now, let's focus now on the modern situation. In the past, migrations were not just caused by conflicts or poverty. The world was much more open, the world was much more available and was much bigger. The planet is now narrower and narrower. Let us say that there were 3 billion people when he was born, and he already knows when he's going to die because he said there's going to be 8 billion people when he's going to die. In any case, planet Earth is now narrower and narrower because there is an increasing number of people on the planet. But there is a lot of demographic tension today. Never had that been the case in the past, in the history of mankind. And here there's a contradiction. there's a certain optimism among international institutions, which tend to say that since the world population is now decreasing its growth rate, it was just over 2% some 40 or 50 years ago when Enrico Letta was born, and now it is just 1%. So there has been a strong reduction of the growth rate in the world population, which will possibly continue, and there's good reason to think so. And that gives room for hope. So the demographic boom is now under control, slowly but surely. Uh, at the end of the century, uh, there will no longer be growth rate because behaviors tend to become similar. Uh, People tend to have the same number of children and to have the same family patterns. Healthcare is now more common, and therefore the life expectancy is now improving. Poorer countries are catching up with richest countries. This is an ongoing trend, and at the end of the century, the population will be more or less stationary. There's going to be 4 billion people more, but it's not much. Yes, there were 4 billion people more just over the 20th century. But the situation is a bit different because there were 4 billion people more compared to 2 billion people, whereas now there's going to be 4 billion people more compared to 6 billion people. So there's as I said, there's a certain optimism, there's a certain tendency to be optimistic. People tend to think that the world will be more stable than today, and therefore countries will have similar demographics in the future. This is also shown by the so-called Sustainable Development Goals, and we're almost fed up with them. Good. It's good that the world is developing and is growing in a sustainable way, but among the many sustainable development goals that should be achieved by 2030, the population now is no longer there, as if it was no longer a problem, as if it was no longer a driving force entailing problems and development problems, because in Europe there is very few children. We're not having children in Europe, as you all know. European families are having very few children, whereas sub-Saharan Africa, for example, is still having a lot of children. Europe, China, Korea are countries where demography is decreasing, with a lot of problems entailed in terms of social problems, relations between different generations, sustainability of public budgets. This is what we can read in the newspapers every day. It's all problems that we know of.
Che di qui a 30 anni.
But even in an area like sub-Saharan Africa, where population will double, well, this is an element that obviously has repercussions on development. So why don't we talk about international migration when we talk about development goals? As if international migration weren't a real danger for many governments and leaders and countries. This uncontrolled migration make development unsustainable. So if Professor Vittadini allows me, or even if he doesn't, in his letter, Pope Francis called Laudato Si. Well, no one talks about population, about demography. There's a lot of space devoted to innovation, but the fact that 40 to 50% of the increase in the greenhouse gases is due to the increase in the population is not even mentioned, even though this is a theme that we all know. Obviously, if the population increases, the environmental pressure is going to increase as well, and we do not know how we're going to sustain that. So population continues to be an element of possible danger for sustainable development. So this is a slide with the graph of the population in the world. So this graph, I don't know whether you can read it, but anyway, the light blue line going upward is the percentage of the world population foreseen in Africa, or rather observed in Africa since the 18th century and foreseen until the end of the century. So when I'm talking about demographic upheavals, that's what I mean. Professor Vittadini talked about the European continent that contained over 20% of the world population at the beginning of the 20th century, and now contains just about 10% of the world population. In 2050, it will be about 6%. So the geodemography of the world is evolving. So the distribution of world population is changing in an unprecedented way. So here you can see Africa, India, China. China will overtake India in a couple of years. And well, these are things that were unthinkable when I was young. China, when I was young, was seen as the most, as the highest populated continent in the world. And now this has changed. So this shows how, from a historical point of view, the geodemography of the world, that is to say, the distribution of world population, has changed. Migration flows are part, or maybe they are a consequence of these changes. I'll show you a table which is quite simple. I'm just asking you to look at just one figure. Oh, there are no figures actually. That's better. We have only these columns. These are Nigeria and Germany. The blue columns, or rather the line, the blue line, the horizontal blue line, is the line that marks the number 100. So this is the development in the next 3 decades up to 2050. And here you can see that there is a substantial increase of the population in the different age classes from now to 2050. This is well true also for the population of Spain, Russia, Italy, and I'm talking about countries where population is decreasing. So this is one of the different aspects that create an imbalance in the situation of demography, and this could lead to demographic movements, flows. So this is a very strong effect. So here you see the active population. Europe and sub-Saharan Africa are interesting. The change in percentages is really interesting. In sub-Saharan Africa, there is an increase by 167%. It might be more. These are forecasts, so obviously they are not 100% precise. But we have a decrease in Europe by 24%. So, as you see, there is a strong imbalance. And here there are other areas, rich areas and poor areas. Japan and the Philippines. The population in Japan is going to decrease more than the Italian population. So we're not alone in this. South Korea, Thailand are experiencing the same decrease. So we are not a very special case in terms of demography, weak demography. We have many other countries that are in the same situation as Italy because demography is becoming weaker and weaker in many countries. So this is the difference between the areas that have a decrease in population. Italy, if we make a comparison between Italy and Northern Africa, here again you see a big gap. There will be a substantial increase in Northern Africa by 60%. So this demographic spring, so to speak, continues to be felt. And the same holds true for the economic aspect, the gap in terms of income in different countries. Here you can see in the right column, you see the difference in dollars of the income between 7 poor countries and 3 rich countries in 1950 and in the year 2000. So the gap is wider and wider. These are what the economists call dollars that can be compared over the time, because obviously they need to take account of devaluation and many other financial and economic aspects. So the difference in income of about $9,000 yearly now become almost $40,000. So the economic push is still there. I'm looking at my watch. I still have 10 minutes. So, the situation in Europe. Europe, as I said, is a weak continent from the demographic point of view. As I always say, Italy will always be the destination of migrants, not maybe at the same level of the last 15 years or before the crisis, before the year 2011-2012. But once we go back to normality, if we ever will, Italy will still have a demand for migrants because our population is decreasing, like Germany, like Spain, like other European countries. Our population is decreasing because there is a higher number of elderly people and the number of adults and young people decrease. So it's more like the structure, the demographic structure that changes rapidly. It is true that the productivity of elderly people can improve with the technology. There are many other aspects that concern prevention, active aging, and so on and so forth. But we all know that, the productivity of a 70 years old cannot be compared to that of a young person of 20 years of age, because we know that there is an increase in productivity up to 20-25 years, then it remains stable for about 40 years, and then it starts decreasing. And also the innovative potential decreases, because the young people are those who make discoveries, are those who can be awarded Nobel Prizes. Maybe elderly people can write beautiful books or beautiful philosophical works, but in terms of production, aging is not a positive element. So Europe will need migrants also in the future. So, well, I believe that countries that have a structural need for migrants, for a substantial migration, and this will depend on political choices and many other factors, but Italy, just like Europe, will continue to need migrants. And these countries should organize themselves in order to have integration. What do we mean by integration? Integration means having a legal framework where migrants are integrated, where migrants are not excluded, where migrants have all the means needed to be integrated. So this is what we have to reflect upon, because migrants normally come to stay. Europe has carried out policies that are barely capable of keeping up with the changes in demographic situations and migratory flows. So Europe has never been able to make long-term choices. The Article 79 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union states that each country can decide the number of migrants it can take. So we have in Europe countries that close their doors and countries that keep their doors open. So there is no common policy here. So, and these are, well, the last minutes I have for my speech. A long-term policy is needed to actually overcome this recent policy of externalization of borders. So we need not to build barriers on our borders, but move these barriers maybe to Libya, to Turkey, or to other countries and areas. Well, this is something that could have a certain amount of success. But this is no solution. This is no lasting solution. So, well, lasting solutions are long-term solutions and call for a very strong commitment. Europe and the Union talked a lot about the so-called migration compacts, that is to say, those agreements with countries of origins where, in exchange for economic support or other kinds of support, foresees the reinforcement of barriers for people that wanted to leave these countries. So these pacts are actually very limited because they are based on the control of the borders. So they include, for instance, the training of public forces on the borders with new tools, but these do not take into account the aspects of regular immigration channels, because we can ask developing country to control people who leave these countries, but there will always be 1,000, 2,000 migrants that will reach our countries, but they will not generate tragedies or imbalances. So this is the path we have to take. So I think that in the long term, the theme of migration and, well, besides the need to, in a way, create a governance, an international governance of migration, which does not exist at the moment and is much needed. So, well, we need 3 letters, PDS, P for peace, for conflict mitigation, so that refugees should no longer come in waves. This doesn't mean the perfect situation of peace, but this means mitigation of conflicts that would already mean that we have made a step forward. So peace on the one hand, human rights on the other, which should be reinforced in the countries of origins of refugees, because often these people leave their countries because of a lack of human rights, and for this same reason it is very difficult to send these refugees back to their countries. And then we have this second aspect, that is are for rights. And then we have D for development. So there can be a good development in certain African areas, but it is a very imbalanced. It's not homogeneous. We have a development in the service sector, in the extraction sector, but there has been no development in industry, in manufacturing, and which are very important in terms of migration. So these are the 3 main elements that could actually work on the long term, and they can work only if Europe acts in a homogeneous way, and if the world supports this. Often we mention the Marshall Plan for Africa, which is wrong, because in order to have a Marshall Plan for Africa, we should have a lot of money, which we don't have. Okay, I'll stop here. I hope I have been clear enough. Thank you for your attention. Well, I think we now have a picture of this great change that cannot be faced with, issuing laws or finding an agreement that can in some way stop migration flows. So this is obviously something we cannot solve within this meeting. There is something more. So the reflections that might be generated by this meeting will help us to have an in-depth analysis of what is happening. And now I would like to ask Margarita and Elena to make their questions.
Accomodarvi e poi il professore risponderà.
Se so rispondere.
Magari dite cosa fate.
Salve, sì. Io sono
My name is Margarita, and I have studied as a consultant in Milan, and I participated in the organization of the exhibitions of last year and this year at the meeting with reference to migrants. My personal experience shows me that this is an unavoidable situation, and it is a huge wave of migration. While organizing this exhibition, I met a lot of new migrants and second generation migrants, and in talking to them, I really realized that meeting them made me, in a way, richer and made me look at migration with different eyes. I don't want to be too naive. And, the questions that visitors asked made me understand that this is a mass phenomenon which is varied, and there are people who are escaping death, escaping poverty, or have other reasons to leave their countries. And it is difficult to understand when these people arrive why they have left their countries. So, through these personal meeting with these people, I have changed my point of view. So I'm asking now how the Italian society can live this phenomenon of migration as a richness, a form of richness. How can this be clear in the Italian society? Let's wait for the second question. My name is Edna. I study at the university in Milan. I study history. And I have a question about what is going to happen after. I have also worked for the exhibition on a new generation of migrants. In particular, at this year's meeting, we have this exhibition on new generations of migrants. And I realized that on very important things, there is not a big difference between me and these migrants, in particular with reference with our families. So I wanted to ask you, what's the situation in Italy and Europe? The increase in the number of migrants coming to Europe. Well, would it be possible to discover what I discovered in organizing the exhibition? That is to say that there is not a big difference between us and them, keeping in mind that migrants will continue coming to Europe.
Belle domande.
Interesting questions.
In realtà c'è un punto di coincidenza tra...
Well, actually, these two questions are in a way similar. That is to say, the main question is how can, or rather, migration per se is not a factor that generates growth and richness, but it can generate growth and richness. So there is a form of migration which is positive for migrants, for the countries that welcome these migrants, and for the countries the countries of origins. And but there is also another form of migration that can have a neutral impact or a negative impact. So we want a positive kind of migration. We want a migration that underlines the skills and the positive characteristics of each migrant. But there is something else I would like to say. It is true that, let's take the Italian example. Let's say that the migrants coming to Italy are very different. There are migrants that are refugees because they are fleeing the danger of death, and there are migrants that come from poor countries and want to improve their living conditions. And so in this situation, in this ongoing situation, because there are migrants that, for instance, could be imprisoned because of the way of what they think or for their religion, because there is discrimination. And so there are different situations. And there are situations that are more serious than others. And I think it is necessary And I think that the international order calls for it. That is to say, we need to make a distinction. Migration needs to be governed, managed. A migrant that is fleeing from death and from discrimination has to be welcomed in our country. We have signed the Geneva Convention. Well, the situation at the time was different. Migrants were coming from Eastern Europe at the time. But the countries that signed the Geneva Convention have the duty to welcome those that are in danger. But then there is another kind of migration, and here countries have the right to govern this kind of migration according to the needs of their society. So this is a right for a state that is based on the votes of its citizens. So it depends on the will of the citizens. So the distinction needs to be made. And this is what local territorial committees are trying to do. That is to say, those commissions that examine the dossiers of the incoming immigrants. They need it, well, these committees or commissions have to decide whether to grant protection or not. And if they are not granted protection, these migrants should be sent back to their countries of origin. Well, this very difficult and painful process that obviously can entail a lot of mistakes needs to be carried on, because there needs to be this distinction. Otherwise, it would be impossible to control migration. It can be done better. We can reduce the number of errors, of mistakes that these committees make. We have the so-called cultural mediators, people who know the language and the culture of the country of origins of these immigrants and are experts. So this is what we are painstakingly trying to do. And I think this is something that we have to continue. And, well, in terms of richness, I'm talking about a richness that has nothing to do with money. I'm talking about cultural richness. So what we need to do is to grant migrants the right conditions to actually express this richness. So everything that discriminates goes against this goal to actually encourage the best of what migrants can do. So discrimination, for instance, is when we deny political rights to second-generation migrants. Because, well, there are many young people who say, I feel Italian, I think I am Italian, but I'm not, because I do not have the Italian citizenship. So this is something else that needs to be solved, especially in this country that will go on needing migrants in the future. So we can actually achieve a positive situation by investing in education, information, in the rights of the migrants, with all the duties that need to be respected by citizens and institutions. When Germany decided to welcome 1 million Syrians, they had saved, well, a substantial amount of money to integrate these migrants. Theoretically, we can do the same here, but very often we do not have the means to do that. And, for instance, if we wanted to teach our language to migrants, we have to do it in the right way. So there can be very innovative projects. As you know, there are many areas in Europe that are depopulated at the moment, and this is a problem. It's a problem in environmental terms, in terms of conservation of the cultural heritage. In the 50s and 60s, there were a lot of farmers from Sardinia that populated the hills of northern Italy. So there need to be plans to integrate, for instance, migrants that come from rural areas and are familiar with animals, with cattle, with rural life, with farms, with new cultural and with new agricultural ways to use the land. So we need to have ambitious programs, not only in the field of agriculture, which is anyway absorbing an increasing amount of foreigners in Italy and also in other Mediterranean countries, which, well, can really turn migration into an added value, and it can be a very high value if we can manage it in the right way. Otherwise, it will be a minimum value, or it could even lead to conflicts. So this is not something that is automatically achieved. It depends on the kind of policies that we will choose.
Cosa interessante che viene fuori da questo.
So what is really interesting in the words that we've just heard is that there is no mechanisms. So we cannot think that these phenomena are positive or negative automatically. There is a human process which is inevitable. The problem is quite a complex. It's a complex one. It is a serious one. It is varied. There is a lack, a sort of abandonment of the demographic problem, as we've heard in international analysis. It's like a problem has been forgotten. It is a complex problem which has no easy solution. Since we first met with President Violante, we need to take on responsibility much more than we did before. Let's think about what many teachers talk about. It is very difficult for them to govern a class where there is many different people. It is difficult to manage a classroom if half of the students don't speak Italian and speak a different language. So we need to take on more responsibility. If we just mourn about the past, then we don't engage in the future. There's a teacher that is working in a comprehensive school in Milan, and she was telling me that in this comprehensive school there's many refugees. Many refugees didn't even go to elementary school in their own country of origin. They don't speak Italian nor English, and this teacher is teaching English. And rather than complaining, this teacher started to spend her afternoon making sheets where she's doing a sort of collage, and she's putting images with the car, the table, putting the English name and Italian name. So in the classroom, she spends her time showing these students the name of these objects. But then again, there's the Italian students and their families who complain because the whole classroom is slowing down and it's not learning. So it is harder to accept mixed classes where you always have to take account of other people. And then there is the problem of employment, labor. So I heard, for example, a dialogue in a bar. There were three poor people speaking, talking about migrants, saying, okay, the migrants are coming here to Italy to steal employment and all benefits from us. When, for example, people apply in order to get a state house, we're talking about poor people of Italian origin, and they have to be taken into account because maybe they've been waiting in a state house for a long time. So responsibility, huge responsibility is needed, and huge sacrifices are needed, and the sacrifices cannot be automatic. Otherwise, we cannot understand why Trump came about. American working classes are now voting for a tycoon because they feel that the left wing is not doing anything for them. That requires time, effort, and a lot of work. We cannot simply have these people coming without thinking that that does not entail awareness. I think that what we have to do in this meeting and in meetings like this one is to promote awareness, and we all need to take on personal responsibility. But we have to take into account of everything. We need to accept what is different. We need to accept others coming, but we also need to organize our lives in a smart way. For example, what the professor was saying about the repopulation of rural areas is absolutely interesting. So on the one hand, we have a large number of migrants coming. We don't know how to feed them, where to put them, where to relocate them. But then again, we have areas of the countries which are totally depopulated. That requires a lot of thinking, which sometimes is lacking. And as the professor was saying, we need to invest in order to have a return, and we must have the means to invest. So we need to be able to learn. So we have seen that this is an era of change, and the era of change, the momentous change, must imply a personal change for us. So we must not feel bewildered or mesmerized at what is happening. We need to understand the phenomenon, and I think that we have learned something tonight, and I think that now we feel like following you, Professor, in your books and articles in the newspapers, because that necessary change in our daily life needs to be accompanied in order to understand what we have to do. As you said, Professor, you were mentioning films, and even in films we can understand what migration was in the past. When we watch films of migrants, of Italian migrants getting to the United States, so we can understand that that country needed a change in attitude at some point that took generations. Now, with these type of meetings here in Rimini, we want to start working along these lines, and hopefully this is going to have a positive result in our life and in the life of future generations. Thank you very much, Professor, for